May 25, 1917. As the First World War ravaged Europe, a deafening explosion tore through the Škoda Works ammunition plant in Bolevec, near Plzeň. The blast shook the city and left hundreds dead or dying. The worst part? It didn't have to happen. A defect was reported. The danger was known, but no one listened. This is the story of the Bolevec explosion and the ignored warning that led to one of the deadliest industrial accidents in Czech history.
Welcome to History Corner.
By the middle of 1917, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was desperate. World War I had drained its resources and battered its military. Behind the front lines, cities like Plzeň had become engines of war. The Škoda Works in Plzeň, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was one of the largest armaments producers in Europe. Founded in the 1850s and rapidly expanded under Emil Škoda, the factory had become vital to the empire's war effort. With World War I entering its fourth bloody year, Škoda was producing vast quantities of artillery shells, guns, and munitions. One of its satellite facilities, the Bolevec ammunition plant, was tasked with storing and assembling explosive shells. But with increased demand came increased risk. Poor safety protocols, rushed production, and a workforce that included many women and children working long shifts surrounded by crates of live ammunition created a volatile environment. To keep up with demand, safety protocols were increasingly overlooked. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Around noon on May 25th, a factory worker named Wojciech Žižka noticed something was wrong. One of the landmines had a defect. Recognizing the danger, she immediately reported it. Rudolf Thiel, the plant's director, was informed of the defect and potential hazards, but Thiel allegedly told her to put the mine away, that he would look at it later, and went home for lunch. No action was taken. Within 2 hours, the consequences would become irreversible. At 1:35 p.m., one of the defective landmines detonated inside building number 10. The initial explosion killed several workers instantly, but the real danger came from what was stored nearby, crates of TNT. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. One room after another erupted in fire and steel. Panic swept the factory floor. Workers screamed and fled, but they weren't free to leave. The Bolevec plant, a military facility, was surrounded by barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and locked gates. Those security measures, meant to keep enemies out, were now trapping hundreds of workers inside a burning death trap. At exactly 2:50 p.m., the main explosion tore through the heart of the facility. The pressure wave was so powerful it could be felt 6 kilometers away. Windows shattered in the center of Plzeň. Shock waves cracked walls. A mushroom cloud rose over the city. But the nightmare wasn't over. Explosions continued for hours into the evening, each one echoing through the city like thunder. Rescue efforts were chaotic. Dozens were trapped behind locked exits. Some suffocated. Others were blown apart. The heat was so intense that parts of the factory simply disappeared. Shock waves could be felt for miles. Windows shattered across Plzeň. All buildings except one, a canteen, were completely destroyed. The rest of the factory was reduced to rubble, but the danger didn't end there. Shrapnel from live ammunition continued to explode, flying through the air for hours. Any misstep could trigger another deadly chain reaction. Rescue efforts were delayed. For hours, no one could safely enter the site, but many refused to wait. Just 5 minutes after the first explosion, members of the municipal fire brigade rushed in. Others followed. But it wasn't until the following day, May 26th, that full-scale rescue operations could begin. Despite extreme caution, dozens more people died during recovery efforts, killed by unexploded munitions or secondary blasts. Children were killed days later when they found live ordnance in nearby fields and forests, playing games with deadly consequences. Doctors, nurses, and Good Samaritans flooded into the area. Dressing stations were set up in the Orlik workers' colony, Chemoshnar village square, and even an inn by the Boleveci pond. The more seriously wounded, burned, blinded, missing limbs were transported by truck to hospitals in Plzeň. By the next morning, Shops, schools, offices, and factories throughout the city shut down in mourning. A total of 42 soldiers and 24 gendarmes were stationed at the site to block access and prevent further tragedy. The military had taken over all operations. According to a report dated May 26, the Škoda Works commander recorded 96 people seriously injured and 276 lightly wounded in hospitals, most of them women and children. 8 firefighters and 11 gendarmes were also among the injured. Some workers survived through sheer luck. A handful had hidden in a tunnel, remaining there for hours before finally escaping to safety. Soldiers of the 35th Infantry Regiment combed nearby forests and hills, collecting scattered explosives and destroying them one by one. The surrounding woods were left scarred and blackened, a reminder that the disaster reached far beyond the factory walls. The official death toll is at 146, but some claim that over 200 people died and 700 were injured. Many bodies were never recovered. Others could only be identified by personal items or charred scraps of clothing. The disaster sent Plzeň into mourning. Rudolf Thiel defended himself by saying that he had to break the regulations on higher orders, which emphasized that peace regulations were abolished during the war. And indeed, 6 weeks before the disaster, the Ministry of the Interior and Public Works allowed Škoda to increase its explosive stocks from the current 10 tons to 60 tons. But on the day of the explosion, the factory contained almost 96 tons of explosives and almost 48,000 finished missiles. During the interrogation on March 23, 1918, when asked whether he felt guilty, Thiel replied, "I plead not guilty." 2 months earlier, Thiel had warned Vienna that the factory was already completely filled with explosives and that no further deliveries could be stored anywhere. In vain, the war machine did not heed any warnings. Rudolf Thiel was eventually charged, but never faced trial. In 1918, a year after the disaster and under investigation for financial fraud, he shot himself in his apartment with his hunting rifle. The Austrian authorities initially tried to sweep the disaster under the carpet, suppressing all mentions in the press and downplaying the situation. The only mention came from the Austrian Correspondence Office, which released the following statement. Bolevec on May 27th. A fire broke out in one of the local ammunition workshops the day before yesterday, which led to the explosion of several buildings of this workshop. Although the consequences of the explosions were not as severe as initially feared, it turned out that a considerable number of people employed in these workshops were killed or injured. The number of corpses pulled out so far is 13. Unfortunately, there are fears that about 50 dead are still under the ruins of the destroyed workshops. Despite the immense destruction, the Bolevec facility was considered so important to the war effort that the government ordered it rebuilt almost immediately. But the Plzeň City Council protested, demanding tighter safety regulations and a smaller-scale reconstruction. The Vienna Imperial Council, Deputy Gustav Habermann, later stated the following. There are 136 dead. However, the number will probably increase because 170 people are missing. There are 625 wounded, of whom 520 were fortunately only slightly injured. Though some sources claim it was rebuilt to its original plans, contemporary records suggest the new factory was indeed scaled down with higher safety standards. A small victory earned from unimaginable loss. The dead were buried in a mass grave, above which stands the chapel of Saint Adalbert. It remains a solemn tribute to those who lost their lives. The Bolevec explosion was a preventable catastrophe. Wojciech Žižka tried to prevent it. A warning was given, a decision was made, and hundreds paid the price. In 1967, on the 50th anniversary, a memorial monument was erected at the Škoda site. 50 years later, in 2017, a second memorial was placed beside it for the centenary, ensuring the memory would not fade with time. Together, these sites mark one of the worst industrial disasters in Czech history, and a tragedy that might have been prevented if one voice had simply been heard. Today, a modest memorial stands near the site, honoring the workers who died. But the disaster remains largely unknown outside the Czech Republic, a tragedy buried beneath the rubble of war and the failures of those in power. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from history. See you next time.